Fundamentals. What is a government shutdown technically? Why does Congress basically hold the keys?
Well, legally, it's pretty straightforward. A shutdown happens when Congress doesn't manage to pass the 12 annual funding bills, or even just a temporary measure, a stopgap, before the current funding actually expires. Once that authority lapses, the government literally can't spend money legally. So operations deemed non-essential have to stop.
And that deadline we always hear about, it's almost always October 1st, right? Beginning of the fiscal year.
Precisely. October 1st is the start line. Now, technically, when that deadline passes without funding, that's a funding gap. The actual shutdown, the closing down of services we see on the news, that only happens when the gap persists and agencies are forced to stop work.
Okay, but here's the really interesting part, historically. Missing that deadline didn't always mean everything ground to a halt. For decades, agencies kind of kept going during gaps, right? Assuming Congress would sort it out.
That's the absolute crux of it. That's why modern shutdown is what it is. That all changed dramatically after 1980. Attorney General Benjamin Civiletti issued these legal opinions, really pivotal. He basically said, no, federal agencies cannot spend any money without specific current approval from Congress. Full stop. So once the funding ran out, it wasn't just awkward anymore. It was legally required. Shut down fully or partially, immediately.
Wow. So that legal opinion didn't just change the rules, it kind of created this perfect high-stakes situation for political fights. The budget deadline suddenly became this massive point of leverage.
Exactly right. Before 1980, missing the deadline was, embarrassing for Congress, a procedural mess. After 1980, it meant locking the doors of federal buildings. That instantly raised the stakes from a legislative headache to a full-blown political crisis cool.
And looking at the numbers since the current budget process started back in '76, there have been something like 20 funding gaps.
That's right, 20 gaps.
And those have led to 10 actual shutdowns, full or partial.
Yeah, and while most of them are pretty short, maybe just a few days, the political desire, or maybe ability, to use the shutdown as a weapon has definitely grown.
Yeah.
I mean, look at the longest one in U.S. history. That was a clear example of using it as leverage. 35 days, from late 2018 into early 2019.
Right, that was over the U.S.-Mexico border wall funding, a real standoff.
Classic case of brinkmanship.
But okay, shutdowns do end eventually. Usually Congress passes what's called a continuing resolution, a CR.
That's the typical way out, yes. A CR is basically a temporary patch. It provides short-term funding, maybe for a few weeks or months. It buys lawmakers more time to argue about the real long-term budget.
And you're saying every single shutdown since 1990 ended this way?
With a CR.
Every single one since 1990, yeah. And that method, the CR, it works to stop the bleeding, end the immediate crisis. But it tells you something darker about how governing works or doesn't work. It means these big fights just get resolved by kicking the can down the road, not by actually agreeing on anything fundamental. That's where I kind of push back on calling it a resolution. If CRs are just temporary band-aids and you're facing the same fight again in, say, 90 days, doesn't that just mean the whole painful shutdown process was, well, kind of useless? Does it ever actually force real compromises?
Historically. Very, very rarely. The CR mechanism gives temporary relief, sure, but it almost enshrines the underlying problem. That short-term fix is often exactly what some political groups want because it lets them avoid making tough structural decisions and being held accountable for them. But the human cost of just hitting the snooze button like that is huge.
Let's shift to that then, the real-world consequences. Because they hit hard and they hit fast, funding lapses, non-essential services stop or get cut way back, and boom, lots of federal workers are furloughed.
Which means placed on unpaid leave instantly.
Yeah, mandatory unpaid leave.
And to really get the scale here, you have to remember the federal government is the biggest employer in the U.S. We're talking about, just over 3 million workers?
Yeah, it's massive. And the economic hit is just staggering when you look at the estimates. The Congressional Budget Office, the CBO, they crunched some numbers. They figured a funding lapse could mean about 750,000 federal employees furloughed each day, like $400 million in lost pay every single day.
And that $400 million, that's not just some abstract number on a spreadsheet, right? That's people's lives.
Yep.
Mortgages, car payments, groceries. And yeah, okay, furloughed federal employees usually get back pay eventually, once the government reopens.
Yeah.
But think about the immediate stress. Rent is still due. But here's what often gets missed. The federal contractors. Thousands of people doing essential support work, cleaning crews, IT support, security, food service folks, they often have no guarantee of back pay. For them, those lost wages are just gone forever.
That ripple effect is huge.
Yeah.
And then there are the services that just stop. National parks,
Yeah.
monuments closed, federal museums, galleries shuttered. Think about all the federal research projects, medical stuff, environmental science.
Yeah.
Halted midstream.
Yeah, big collection stops, experiments are ruined potentially,
Yeah.
and things like IRS taxpayer services get reduced, often right when people need help. Processing for certain benefits can get delayed too.
But then some things have to keep running. The so-called essential personnel. They have to work, often without getting paid in real time.
Exactly, because their jobs are considered vital for safety, security, or because they handle mandatory spending like Social Security. So you see military members still on duty, federal law enforcement still working, air traffic controllers still in the towers, Social Security checks still go out, Medicare benefits are still processed. Those are generally protected.
So you end up with this really weird situation. The government can, like, keep the military running and send out retirement checks, but it can't keep the Smithsonian open or process a research grant.
It creates this enormous strain and, frankly, a morale problem. You're forcing people to work without pay. You're essentially asking essential workers to personally finance the political dysfunction happening in Congress.
What about things like the post office? Or getting a passport?
Right, the U.S. Postal Service usually keeps running because it's largely self-funded through its own revenue. And the passport agency often stays open too, sometimes funded by its fees or specific exceptions. But it's still disruptive overall.
Okay, so we see who suffers, we see the economic cost, the disruption, but this cycle, the fact that it keeps happening, what does that say about how stable our system of governing actually is? Which leads us right into that political critique we mentioned, the idea that this is all just high-stakes performance art.
Yeah, if we sort of zoom out to the bigger picture, a lot of analysis suggests the shutdown has become detached from, its original budget purpose. It's seen as this recurring ritual of theater and psychodrama, where the political messaging seems more important than the actual outcome for the country.
But who actually benefits from this kind of chaos? It seems like everyone loses when the economy takes a hit and people aren't getting paid.
Well, in the short term, various political players feel like they benefit, or they can spin it that way. One side might use the threat of a shutdown to fire up their base, paint their opponents as reckless spenders. Another group can position themselves as the brave defenders of essential programs. And still others might use the crisis atmosphere to demand really deep spending cuts they could never get past during normal times, posing as the guardians of fiscal responsibility.
And the whole time this performance is going on, the real underlying problems like the national debt, they just keep getting worse, right?
Absolutely.
Yep.
That's the deep irony. The U.S. financial situation keeps deteriorating, the debt keeps climbing, the bureaucracy often keeps growing. And the shutdown fight becomes this kind of noisy distraction that prevents any serious conversation about those long-term structural issues. It masks the decay. And when the whole system gets reduced to these kinds of performative fights, it encourages wire pulling and abusive procedures, as some analysts call it. It becomes the main way to exert control.
Abusive procedures, what does that look like in practice? Can you give an example?
Well, there was a specific incident cited recently related to the Speaker of the House during one of these standoffs. The claim was the Speaker deliberately refused to swear in a newly elected member of Congress because her vote could have potentially changed the outcome on a key bill, maybe one to keep the government open, or maybe related to forcing votes on other divisive issues tied to the funding. It was seen as a pretty blatant abuse of the rules, basically trying to block a legitimate representative from voting to achieve a specific political outcome in the shutdown. That's the kind of political decay people point to. It turns the legislative process itself into just another tool for partisan warfare, not for governing. You're using the absolute core function, funding the government, as leverage for totally separate political fights.
When does this stop being about budgets and start feeling more like, well, political performance?
Yeah, and this is crucial because we're not just talking about missed deadlines here. We're really looking at a pattern, maybe a cycle of dysfunction. A lot of analysis suggests the modern shutdown is less about finding common ground and more like a recurring bit of theater and psychodrama, as some put it.